of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiachin and the queen mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the skilled workers and artisans had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elasah, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And the letter said, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you the hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. From the book of Mark. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is the word of the Lord. We're walking through, of course, our vision statement for this ministry, and trying to understand, break down the different parts of it, and to understand what the Bible says about this vision statement and how it gives us fuel and guidance for living this out as a community. We're small, but we're still thinking of the mindset of what are we doing here when we gather? What's the larger purpose? And today we're going to look at the part of this vision statement that says to serve the city of Seoul and beyond, and specifically to serve the city of Seoul. And we're going to be examining what does it mean as a Christian community to serve the city, and the Christian faith is actually very, very unique in that, as we see in the letter of Jeremiah, it calls the citizens of God to serve the city that they live in. Now, there's a couple unique things about cities, and we find ourselves in a major city right now in Seoul, major metropolitan city. Most often cities, what's unique about them is that they're the birthplace of culture. They're the birthplace of ideology, more often than not. Of course, in Athens, in ancient Athens, you had philosophy being born, ancient Greek philosophy. The Enlightenment, we credit to being taking place in Paris, in the salons of Paris and in the pubs of London and of Oxford. And the Renaissance movement, the Renaissance art movement, of course, in Florence was their birthplace. See, cities, and this is why it's unique that you and I are in this place right now in Seoul, is because cities are where culture and ideology, more often than not, are born. And because of that, cities also represent, more often than not, what we as a culture value. Now let me put it this way. If you were to go throughout history and look at every major city, if you want to know what that city or what that culture values, all you really have to do is look at what is the tallest building in that city. More often than not, this is the case. Of course, in ancient Greece, if you were going to Athens from a distance, you would see the temples to the gods up on the high places. And that's why, because that was the most valued part of their culture at the time, was worship. But also we know that in the temples, it's where you conducted business and where you had social relationships. And so that was what they valued. Medieval times, let's fast forward, medieval Europe. The tallest buildings, actually by law, were what? Churches. There were laws saying you can't build a building higher than a church in most major cities in Europe during that time. Why? Because they valued religion. Now, whether they did it the right way or the wrong way is a different story, but at least they valued it. That's what it was. Now, fast forward to our time. Look at our major cities. And more often than not, if you look at what the tallest buildings are, you can look at what that city and what that culture values the most. Of course, I came from New York City, and even in Los Angeles where I lived, it's the same way. Los Angeles, the tallest building is the U.S. Bank Building. Commerce, finance, trade, there's law firms in there. And successful businesses. And in New York City, of course, the same thing happens. See, cities are unique because they give us sort of a picture, a snapshot for what the culture can value. And because cities are where culture is born, it gives you and I, now that we are in this major city, it gives us a chance to shape culture, to change culture a little bit. Do you realize that? That's actually a powerful responsibility. You thought you were just living in Seoul and working. No, if you're in a city, you're in the middle of a culture-shaping mechanism. And you have a chance, we all do, and we're called to by God, to look at the culture and to see how we can shape it rather than it shape and change us. The other thing about a city is that more often than not, people go to cities for a better life. They go to the city for what the city can give them. They go to the city for a job. They go into the city for school. They go into the city, we all do, to some degree, for what the city can offer us. You can think about, why are you here in Seoul right now? And whether you call it your home and you were born and raised here, or whether you're here like I am temporarily, what brought us here? More often than not, cities draw out the self-interest of everyone around them. And people come into the city to see what they can get out of the city for themselves. Now here's the problem with that. If you and I go into the city, if we live in Seoul right now and we're here for how it's going to benefit us, what we do is we turn into consumers. We start taking from the city. We start trying to build our resume, build our reputation, build our career, build our intellect, whatever it may be, and yet we start to take from the city rather than give back. St. Augustine wrote a book, The City of God, a very long book, still interesting. And he wrote it to capture the two types of cities. He says, essentially, and there's a quote in your bulletin on the back, St. Augustine says this: if you're living in a city, you're in a physical city, for this case it was Rome that he was talking about, but let's say Seoul. He says if you're living in a city, you are essentially living in either one of two real cities. You're either living in the city of man, he calls it, he gives a title, the city of man, or you're living in the city of God. And it's your choice, he says, but you're going to be living in one of these. Let me give you the context here. He wrote this book, The City of God, when Rome, the mighty, powerful Rome, had just been sacked by the Visigoths. It had just been taken over. And all of its citizens in Rome were panicked and scared. They all were questioning, how did this happen? This was Rome. we're the strongest nation. I mean, we're the strongest city-state. We're Rome. Who can attack us? And so they started to have an identity crisis and say, wait a second, what's wrong with our city? And Augustine writes this book to basically say to them, to his readers, nothing's wrong with the city. Something's wrong with your attitude about the city. He says, you either can live in the city of man, and here's the summary of the city of man. If you and I live in the city of man, Augustine says, we'll always be seeking out our own interest. And this is what he thinks happened in Rome. He says, basically, people were coming into Rome not to build Rome up, but to build themselves up, to build their resume, to make money, to be successful, whatever reason. And he says, when you have that happen, the city is bound to fail. Because you have all these individuals working for their own good, not for the good of the place they live. They're working for their own reputation, not for the reputation of the city. And he says that's why Rome, he says, was the city of man, because ultimately its citizens were serving themselves, and they were serving other men and their reputation. And he says, but he contrasts this with the city of God. And he says, if you live in the city of God, while you're in the city of Seoul or Rome or wherever it may be, he says what you're going to start doing is you're going to start realizing that God has already controlled the city. And you're going to start caring less about building up your own resume. You're going to start caring less about your own interest. And he says instead you're going to be able to look around the city and find the interest of the other people in the rest of the city. He says you're going to be able to start to see where other people are feeling pain or loneliness, or where your resources can be used to build up the city instead of yourself. Now, how does this practically work out? How do you know if you're in the city of man or in the city of God? If you believe Augustine, you're in one of them, and we probably bounce between the two. How do we know? Let me tell you, this is the way I found out that I was in the city of man, and it took place in New York, and I call it my Floby story. Now, Floby, for those of you who are not from America, you probably don't know what the Floby is. Oh, it's a magical device. The Floby was, I think early 90s maybe it's still popular. It's a hair cutting machine, okay? And I call it the Floby story because hopefully you'll never forget it after I tell this story. The Floby is this machine that's almost like a vacuum, right? You put it next to your head and it sort of sucks up your hair and it cuts your hair. Right? And it was notorious, well, it was a cheap machine, but it was notorious for giving rather bad haircuts because people would be doing it themselves at home and it'd be sort of uneven, right? Now, I tell you that it has really not much to do with the story except for the other main character in the story. This is my Floby story, and this is the way I found out that how I was serving in the city of man rather than the city of God. Okay, New York City, I went to go to college. I'm a young guy, 18, 19 years old, and I was working full-time while going to school. I was working full-time for a rather famous music television company in New York City, MTV. And so my job, this was one of the coolest jobs I've ever had. My job as an 18, 19-year-old guy was to go out and interview these musicians. I interview them, I'd go to the concerts, get backstage, interview them, mainly urban music, and then I'd write about it and I'd put it on our website. And this is when the web was still sort of new, not new, but people were still getting used to it. So I had this fantastic job, 18, 19-year-old guy, and I'm going out there and I'm interviewing all these famous musicians, all these guys I really looked up to and admired, and I was having the time of my life, and slowly I started to get a nice little reputation. If you do a good interview for an artist, they tend to tell another one, and then their agent will call you. So I was getting phone calls. People were calling me instead of me calling them. And I was getting phone calls to say, hey, can you come out and interview this guy or review this album? And I said, of course, I'll do it. I love it. This is awesome. Now, the problem with this, the reason why I told you about Floby, there was a guy in my office. His real name was John. But he called himself Floby. Now, we didn't make fun of him like this. He gave himself the nickname Floby because he owned one of those machines and he liked to give himself a haircut using that machine. He was so proud that he saves all this money, although his hair was always looked horrible. But we did not make fun of him. He called himself Floby. I want that to be on the record here. Anyway, Floby, and hopefully you'll never forget this guy, Floby exposed how I was living in the city of man. And it happened this way. there was this artist that I wanted to interview, this musician. I really looked up to this guy. I thought he was going to be extremely famous, and I was extremely wrong. But at the time, nobody knew. So I wanted to interview him so badly. I just wanted to meet him so badly. And it was so hard to get an interview with him, almost impossible. I called his agent, and I begged and begged for weeks and weeks, probably months. And finally, the agent said, yes, you can interview him. So he said, he'll be there Monday at 11 o'clock in your office. So I could hardly sleep that weekend. I built my reputation up so well that finally this agent said, yeah, you can interview this guy. So I was going to meet him finally. I was so excited. Anyway, Monday morning comes and couldn't hardly sleep through the weekend. Monday morning comes around, 10:30, no phone call, no nothing. I'm pacing back and forth through the lobby. 11 o'clock, nothing. No phone call. 11:15, 11:20 goes by, and I call his agent, voicemail, nothing. So I start to get really worried, something happened, they pulled out, and I start to get really upset. Then I turn the corner, and I see Floby, this guy, shaking hands with the artist and saying goodbye to him. What had happened was Floby stole my interview. He stole it. He actually called the agent, told them a different time. They had come in, and he kind of had done it secretly. This was the way the music business worked. If you wanted something, you went out and got it. Now, I was flaming mad. Not necessarily even at Floby, this guy. Oh, I was red in the face. I ran over to my boss's office, and I screamed, and I was yelling. I was almost to tears. And my boss looks at me and says, what's the problem? He's like, I know that Floby took your interview, but here's the thing. He goes, I'll give you tickets to his show, so you can go meet him. That's what you wanted to do after all. And I said, no. And I yelled, and I said, you know what I told my boss? I said, this is embarrassing. This guy ruined my reputation. This guy made me look like an idiot. See, now, I was at 18 or 19, at that time probably 19, really immature. But all I cared about, I didn't care about the musician. I didn't care about meeting him, really. What I cared about was my reputation. And Floby showed me at that time that I was in New York City for me, not for anyone else. See, Floby exposed that I, at that time, and many times after that, was living in the city of man. I was living in a city where what counted was my reputation, my name, my everything was built up and wrapped up into my profession, my job. Now, you can probably identify whether you're living in the city of man or the city of God. Are you fighting out for your reputation? Why are you here in Seoul? Why are we here as a community? God in Jeremiah shows us a radical new way to look at community and how it interacts with the city. To get us out of the city of man and to put us firmly into the city of God, where we're serving the needs of others, not ourselves. How does God want us to do that? If you look back at the letter of Jeremiah, there's two ways that these exiles, what had happened was Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, had taken the Israelites, conquered them, and brought them back into Babylon. And these are exiles, and it says they're artists, they're musicians, they're court officials, they're businessmen. And they find themselves here in Babylon, a foreign city with a foreign language. Babylon at the time was extremely modern, highly technological, an advanced society, very fashionable, very, very, very forward-thinking. Sound familiar? Sounds sort of like where we are right now. These exiles, though, were struggling with how to live within the city. They didn't know what to do. And the Babylonians, on the one hand, said this. The Babylonians said to them, they were geniuses, by the way. The Babylonians said, come into our city. All you have to do is adapt and change. Become just like us. Do what we do. Act the way we act, and you'll be fine. We see this in the book of Daniel, when Daniel's one of these exiles, and they literally change his name to Belshazzar, saying that Baal is my God. See, the Babylonians said, come into our city, that's fine. If you live in our city, fine, but assimilate and be just like us. Don't be any different. Be the same as us and you'll get along fine. That was one way to do it. But in Jeremiah 28, we didn't read it. The false prophet, Hananiah, he's an Israelite, and he's a false prophet. He writes a letter to the exiles and says this. I'll sum it up for you, and you can read Jeremiah 28 later. He says, be in the city for a little while. But in 2 years, God's going to break the yoke of Babylon, and you're going to get out of there. So what he's basically was saying, he looks at these exiles and says, be in the city for a little while. But in 2 years, you're getting out of there. So don't invest in the city, he says. Don't do anything good for the city. Don't care about the city of Babylon, because in 2 years, you're going to be gone. So what do you care? Now, both views, they seem very, very different. The Babylonian view says, assimilate, adapt, blend in, change your name. And the other side, Hananiah, says, no. Be in the city for a little bit, get what you can, but in the end, get out, because it's an impure place. And both of those look so different, the perspectives, but really what they are, they're basically the same. They're inherently selfish. They're inherently selfish. They're a way of saying, I'm going to go into the city for my good and what it can do for me. But God calls us to a very, very different way to interact with the city in the letter of Jeremiah. And today, I'm going to go through this quickly, the principles here of what he says. I'm not going to give you the particulars. And what I mean by that is this. I'm going to give you the principles of what he says in Jeremiah to these exiles. But we as a community here, if we call ourselves a community and a family, this Amen Soul English ministry, it's up to you and I to figure out the particulars of how this is lived out into the city of Seoul. I can give you a lot of good ideas, and I'll give you a couple suggestions, but it's really up to us to talk with one another to figure out how we apply these principles from Jeremiah onto the city of Seoul. What are the principles? First, and I did it just basic verbs here, plant, increase, and seek. Plant, increase, and seek. First, plant. You look in verse 5. He says what? He says to settle down, plant gardens. What is he saying here? He's telling the people what you have to do. This means, the implication of this in an agrarian society means that the Israelites would have had to plant gardens, take out the crop, and probably go to the marketplace to sell it. This means economic involvement into the city in which you live. Economic investment, he says. He says, settle down, plant a garden, go to the market, buy seeds. It's a call from God to get jobs in the marketplace of the city that you live in, to be involved, to look at your jobs, no matter what your job is. If it's finance, law, it could be any job. But your job is an integral part of God's working in the city, he says. You're planting a garden. It means to get involved with trade and investment in the city. Now, this is not permission to just go shop at Shinsegae after service. Although shopping's not, I'm not saying it's bad. That's one way you can give back to the city. But here's I'm going to give, I said I wasn't going to give particulars. I'm just going to give one very, very quickly of the way that this was lived out to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. In Brooklyn, New York, about, I want to say 10 or 12 years ago, there's four married young couples, no kids. And they were living in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, which had been a poor neighborhood, but rents were starting to increase. And these were Christian couples. They looked around at the rents that were increasing at the brownstones, these old, beautiful buildings in Brooklyn, New York. And the residents had to move out because they couldn't afford these ever-increasing rents. And so the four couples got together, and they said, individually, we can't really do anything about this. But as four couples together, 8 people, what they did was they pooled their money together, all of their investments in their bank accounts. They pulled their money together, and they bought a brownstone, one of these bigger brownstone buildings, the older buildings. And they effectively had, since they bought it, they could charge whatever rent they want. They controlled the rent so that the citizens, the people who had been living in that building for 20, 30, whatever years, could stay. See, these 4 people looked around at their immediate environment and said, look, this is the way we can make our money work. We can do something with our money that promotes the well-being of the city around us. So he says settle and plant, but he also says in verse 6 to increase. Increase in numbers. Now, what does this mean? It means that the Israelites, he says, marry, give your sons and daughters in marriage. And what that means, the implication at the very, very least, means that the Israelites would have had to mingle with the Babylonians. These are two cultures that did not get along, two cultures that were foreign to each other. But he says, no, I want you to increase there. I want you to get to know your neighbors, even though you don't look like them, act like them, or even share the same language. It's also a call, he says, to not wait. A lot of people, if you're in Seoul right now, like me, temporarily, you may say, well, I'll wait to start a family, or I'll wait to do this, or I'll wait to do that until I go back home. And not just families, anything, but God says, no, it's now, he says, while you're in the city, that I want you to increase, spread out, grow. Don't just be your own little group that meets together, that talks about home together, and that wishes they could go back together. No, he says, look out into the city. Increase. And lastly, he says, the last principle that he gives the exile, those who are in exile, is to seek. He says, seek what? The peace and prosperity. Now, this word peace is probably one of my most favorite words in the Bible. It's the Hebrew word shalom, right? And if you know this word, it's so much deeper and richer than our English word for peace. When I say peace to you, that usually means good tidings or be happy or something like that. No. This peace, he says, is shalom, which means the overall well-being of the city. He says, this is radical. God looks at his people, and he says, I want you to seek the peace and prosperity of the city, even if it means it sacrifices some of your peace and some of your prosperity. He wants us to give our resources. He wants to give our families to the city. He wants us to give up our peace to the city. He says, you should be praying for it. You notice what he says here. You're connected to the city. And he doesn't mean pray for it in a way to say, oh, I hope all those lost sinners find Jesus. No, he says pray for it to succeed. Pray for the city to grow. Pray for the city around you to flourish. And then he says, you too will flourish. Now, if I've done any bit of my job today, you probably feel like this is an impossible task. Hopefully. I think I was always told by one of the great preachers who I admired, when you preach a sermon, to make people feel inadequate and then come in with the gospel and make them feel empowered. So hopefully, this is hard. This is tough stuff for you and I to look at the city of Seoul and say, okay, wait a second. I'm not here to build my resume. I'm not here to build up my reputation. I'm not here to build up my success. I'm here to build up the people around me. I'm here to sacrifice for the city that I live in. And I'm going to seek out every way in which I can do that, both with my money, with my family, with my resources, with my time, with my energy, with everything. I'm going to seek the utter shalom of the city that I live in. That sounds almost impossible. God looking at you and saying, you give up everything that you have for your neighbors. How do you do this? How do we do this? Here's the problem. Every week I preach the gospel. At the end of the sermon, I try to dedicate at least 5 to 10 minutes to showing and teaching how the gospel, the truth, the good news that Jesus Christ died for you to bring you back to God, how that ought to change you radically and fundamentally in every way possible. The way you spend your money, the way you spend your time, the way you form relationships. I do this every week, and the problem with doing it every week is that the gospel can become sort of like a formula. You sit here and hopefully you get a little intellectually stimulated, hopefully. You start to think about new ideas, but at the end of the day, we walk out and we say, okay, I get it, the gospel. 1 + 2 = 3, I get it. Jesus died for me, God loves me, okay. But tomorrow's Monday, and how am I going to do this? And I recognize that that's a problem, because I preach the gospel every single week. Even for me, it can become like a formula. But here's the thing, brothers and sisters. If you and I are ever to live the way that he's commanding these exiles to live, if we're ever to be the Jeremiah community that seeks the shalom of the city at the risk of our own peace, who doesn't want to build our resume but wants to build up other people around us, if we're ever going to make that a reality, we have to see the one who first did it for us. I read the passage of Mark because what's happening here in the passage that we read of Mark. If you look back at it, James and John, the two of the closest disciples to Jesus, come to Jesus and